Hello fellow YouTube friends, followers, fools and flabbergasters, my name is Mason and it's time for another Guild Wars 2 easy and flexible build guide. The goal of this guide is to enable you as much flexibility and low switching costs between PvE game modes on a particular class and elite specialization. This means that whenever possible I will use only one set of gear with slight alterations. To accomplish that goal I suggest gear that allows for high damage and the necessary defense/support is accommodated for through traits, food and skill changes only. Today's class of choice is the Elementalist and the elite specialization is the Tempest. We're going to talk through two different build variants, an open world roaming build and a conditioned DPS build. And the build links are as always in the description of the video. But before we dive in, let's talk some pros and cons. The build does great damage, around 37k on the golem with elementals and that mostly at range. It also has great support capabilities by providing might, protection, alacrity, stability and auras. And finally, it's highly survivable because protection on Tempest is stronger and it provides permanent protection to itself. The main downside of it that I see is that there's mediocre access to CC and using CC requires swapping to air and water quickly. Alright, fellow build guide enjoyers, it's been a while since I had an Elementalist on the channel, so today's video is gonna be about Tempest, which has just been buffed. I'll go over a very simple spin to win Tempest build that allows you to breeze through all PvE content. Tempest is a specialization that has been overlooked for a while now and I hope that more people start realizing that after the damage buff to it. It's still not a build that will put you on top of all of the DPS charts everywhere, but it does great damage nonetheless and excels at doing harder content and in situations where support is actually lacking. Before we dive into the details of skills and all, let's discuss the playstyle of Tempest in general. Overall, Tempest adds a few dimensions to the Elementalist profession, giving players access to potent shouts, the Warhorn weapon and overload abilities. Overloads have different effects depending on the attunement the Tempest is currently using and provide powerful offensive or defensive capabilities. In this build we'll be camping fire attunement basically all day, except for when defense or CC is needed. In those cases we can go into earth, air or water briefly depending on what we need. So the only overload that really matters to us for damage is overload fire. This skill shoots a barrage of fire projectiles, creating fire explosions and inflicting burning damage on foes caught in the blast radius. It also grants 2 stacks of might on its 10 total pulses, allowing you to cap might on yourself and allies quite easily, especially when using arcane or combined with a shout feel the burn. More on that later. The first part of this ability is a channel during which you spin. This applies burning while spinning and is both a moving fire field and a whirl finisher, so on top of the burning you see in the tooltip, it applies more during the channel. Once you stop spinning, this overload leaves behind another fire combo field. Depending on the trait choices you make, overloads gain additional benefits. With Harmonious Conduit you gain both stability and swiftness when starting an overload, preventing enemies from interrupting the channel. This comes at the cost of damage though. Unstable Conduit also makes your overloads apply auras. Auras are effects that apply conditions, damage, stuns, etc. to enemies and boons to you when you get hit. Auras are an integral part of Tempest since granting or gaining auras has additional benefits too. When using Tempestuous Area you gain additional damage when you apply an aura to yourself or allies, and when using Earth, Elemental Shielding applies protection whenever you grant an aura. You also gain a fire aura whenever you attune to fire or use overload fire. In general, on Tempest the trait choices and utility skills vary between open world and instance content. In instance content will choose traits and utilities that enable the highest damage, whereas in open world will choose traits and utilities that provide more survivability and group support at the cost of some damage. I'll cover the open world variant later in a dedicated section. In this build we'll be using a scepter and a focus. These two are the strongest weapons for damage you can use and also allow you to deal most of your damage from range, making you flexible in terms of positioning. You can use a Warhorn too, which improves might coverage and does only slightly less damage on this build. Let's go through the most relevant weapon skills quickly. In fire you'll want to use all skills on cooldown, they are more or less there to apply tons of burning to enemies. Fire 2, Dragon's Tooth, is a delayed attack that does great damage. This is also a blast finisher, applying might to allies when used inside a fire combo field. Fire 3 is Phoenix. This is a ground targeted projectile that applies burning and more burning to enemies that are already burning. Once it returns to you, it also cleanses a condition and grants vigor, which is very nice. Fire 4 Flame Wall is a ground targeted fire field. Fire fields are important as sources for additional burning and might and will increase your strike damage via the trait Persisting Flames. Fire 5 is Fire Shield and this applies a fire aura to you and does not have a cast time. This will trigger all benefits of gaining an aura immediately after using it, so it grants increased damage and or protection depending on which traits you use. Use both casts of this on cooldown. In Water and Air, the main skills of interest are Air 5 and Water 5. Both of these have 900 range and apply strong CC when used. Whenever you have to break a break bar, swap to Air and use Gale, swap to Water and use Comet, and then go to either Earth or Fire depending on what is available. In Air Attunement, Air 2 does not have a cast time and applies vulnerability and damage, so you can use it while doing other things there too. Whenever you need more defense, you can swap to Earth Attunement. Earth 2 is a skill with 2 casts where the first option applies 250 toughness to you for 30 seconds. That's a pretty massive damage reduction, so around 10% that you can make use of. If you don't need that, use the second cast to apply bleeding. Earth 4 is a projectile reflect and Earth 5 makes you invulnerable for 3 seconds. Using these two in combination can get you out of dangerous situations very well. Alright, moving on to utilities. The default utility skills for damage provide a mix of strike damage and lots of burning. As the heal skill, I mostly alternate between 2 options. The first is Signet of Restoration. This heals you for every skill you cast, including instant casts. This leads to a quite nice amount of passive healing. You can also activate it for another heal. When using the Earth specialization, you retain the passive afterwards and gain an aura. When using Arcane, you do not. The second option is Arcane Brilliance. This will also apply burning when using the Arcane specialization via the trait Elemental Surge. This trait also grants you increased crit damage when using an arcane skill, so your heal skill becomes a source of damage via burning and via this buff. Elemental Surge is also the reason why we use the next skill, Arcane Power. This works like the Venom skills on Thieves, so that you apply the effect of this skill to nearby allies, including elementals if nobody else is around. You and your allies will apply burning with each attack from the skill and gain 5% increased critical damage for the next 2 attacks. The burning stacks count for your damage, which is why this build also scales with having allies around when using Arcane. This skill can also be precast before entering combat and is not removed on entering. A skill that you should always have on is Signet of Fire. This applies 2 very long-lasting stacks of burning and grants a passive 180 precision. When using Earth, this also applies an aura to you and keeps the 180 precision when it's on cooldown. In group content, I usually run the Glyph of Lesser Elementals. This summons 1 lesser elemental per cast and allows you to have multiple of them active at the same time. Each of them provides passive damage and acts as an ally when you have no other allies around. If you don't want to run the lesser elementals, you can use Feel the Burn as the next skill. This grants another aura and might to yourself and allies and applies damage and burning in a large radius. This is a really good skill, especially for open world. As the elite skill, I usually slot the elite Glyph of Elementals. This summons a larger elemental than the other glyph. This elemental always comes with an instant cast skill with a short cooldown. This is important because with the trait Final Shielding in Arcane, using this will trigger you to block 3 incoming attacks every 13 seconds and allow you to maintain Arcane Lightning easily. This is huge for damage and defense. You can also time this to be able to block attacks whenever you need to. The additional options to run in open world will be discussed in a separate section later when we talk about very easy and powerful ways to increase survivability in open world. Moving on to gear and consumables. The gear of this build is quite specific and can be costly for the ideal gear, but you can use budget gear for this very well. The ideal gear consists of running a mix of Viper and Grieving and or Sinister. You can do different combinations, it's just important that you reach 100% burning. If you can't afford Viper, Sinister or Grieving gear, just use cheap Ritualist in place of Viper and Carrion instead of Sinister or Grieving. Since the damage differences between the 3 variants are very small, you can basically choose what fits best to other characters. The setup with 30% overall Conti duration is probably the most flexible one, as it can be adapted easily to suit Weaver too. I chose the gear so that you have to use as few pieces of Grieving or Sinister as possible, since Viper in Ascended is more flexible and used by more other builds. The sigils you use also depend on the iteration of the build. The iteration I chose uses a Torment or Earth sigil on the offhand, where the Earth sigil is much cheaper than the Torment sigil. You always kinda need the Bursting sigil, which is unfortunately a little costly. As for food, you have 2 options depending on the iteration that you use. Fishy Rice Bowl for the 15% burning duration or standard Conti damage and expertise food, which also allows you to use Ascended food easily. The utility item is the Toxic Focusing Crystal, since it provides the highest damage. If you can't afford it, you can also use a Writ of Masterful Malice for a slight gain to condition damage. Let's get to traits and specializations. The default specializations for damage are Fire, Arcane and of course Tempest. Note that Earth is not far behind Arcane in terms of damage and increases utility noticeably by providing a lot of auras and protection around you on demand, which is why we'll use it in the open world variant. Let's start with the Fire specialization, as it is used on all iterations in the same way. It is beneficial for both Conti and strike damage, makes you apply more burning and makes burning have a longer duration. It also reduces the cooldown of fire weapon skills, so it fits to the build very well. It also increases the duration of the fire fields you place, like Flame Wall, and grants you increased strike damage every time a fire field placed by you hits a foe. Since Tempest deals a quite noticeable amount of strike damage even on the Conti build, this is important. The second specialization for group content is Arcane. You can also use Earth for a very small DPS loss, but with Arcane your damage ramps up much faster, so I'd recommend going for Arcane in groups. The concentration from this also increases your coverage of boons, which is a nice side effect. With the traits of choice, Arcane will further apply burning on critical hits every 3 seconds and on every hit of Arcane skills. Remember that the Grandmaster trait triggers on every hit of Arcane power, and the burning stacks applied by allies from it count for your damage. Tempest is the elite specialization of choice, and it makes this a spin to win build. With the traits of choice, Tempest makes Overload grant auras and protection, gives you increased concentration and 10% more strike and condition damage for a time when applying an aura to an ally. On Tempest, protection is actually stronger, making it reduce incoming strike damage by a whopping 40% instead of 33%. Finally, the Grandmaster trait Transcendent Tempest gives you another 15% damage for 7 seconds whenever you complete an overload. We're not making full use of this since we're only using the fire overload, but it's very strong nonetheless. If you notice that Alacrity uptime is lacking, you can also use Lucid Singularity instead of Transcendent Tempest. This will make you provide a good amount of Alacrity when camping fire. A full Alacrity build requires more adjustments to gear and such, which is why that could be part of another video. Now, for open world, it can make sense to make a build more forgiving so that you can sustain on your own. Condi Tempest is probably the best build to run for Elementalists if you want something that can be made very resilient very easily. It can provide permanent protection around it for a small damage loss, covers a lot of might on itself, and provides good passive healing. It also provides Aegis to allies on demand, which is very strong too. As usual, we'll follow a particular priority list for survivability changes. Gear is expensive unless you have legendary gear, so we'll adjust food and trades first. On Tempest, you should not need to adjust gear, food or utility items anyway. The first major step to increase survivability is to use Earth instead of Arcane. We won't be swapping to Earth very frequently, but the traits of choice make the build very tanky without affecting damage too much. I run Earth in open world pretty much everywhere, even in harder metas like Dragon's End where damage matters. It natively decreases damage you take from nearby foes by 10% and all incoming strike damage by another 10%. The two key traits in Earth are Elemental Shielding and Written in Stone. Written in Stone makes your signets keep their passive effects when they are on cooldown and further grants you an aura upon activating one. Elemental Shielding applies protection every time you grant an aura to yourself or allies. So applying auras is a simple way to maintain protection, massively increasing survivability. In order to trigger this trait on yourself and allies often, we'll use the following set of utility skills. Signet of Restoration, Signet of Fire, Feel the Burn and Aftershock. Every one of these skills applies an aura either only to yourself, in the case of signets, or even on allies around you in the case of shouts. I discussed everything aside from Aftershock already. Aftershock is a great shout that synergizes very well with the kit. It grants Aegis and a magnetic aura to allies, making yourself and them reflect projectiles and block the next attack. It further applies Immobilize, and through this Immobilize applies AoE bleeding through the trait's Strength of Stone. With this skill loadout and camping fire, you should be able to breeze through almost all content in the game. There are a few additional tweaks you can make to prepare for particular situations though. In case you need frequent Condi cleanses, smothering auras in fire is worth looking at. This cleanses conditions whenever you grant an aura to an ally, and transmuting one via Focus 5 cleanses 2 conditions in an AoE around you. This costs some damage but can make your life in some situations much easier. If you want, you can also use Elemental Bastion instead of Transcendent Tempest. This will heal the target of any aura you apply, including yourself. It also gives a Frost aura in an area when you get hit below 75% health, giving you and allies another safety net. Finally, using Harmonious Conduit gives you stability and swiftness on using an overload. This is good to prevent enemies from interrupting your overload fire. If all of that is not enough, which it should be, you can change to minus 10% damage taken food and potions of Karka Toughness for another 16% or so damage reduction. With all of these possibilities, you should be good to go for all PvE content so that despite playing an Elementalist, you won't be spending 90% of the time in downstate. In order to define the playstyle more clearly, let's talk about the rotation of Spin to Win Tempest. As I said before, we'll be camping Fire Attunement unless CC or defense is required. In the opener, precast both Arcane Power and both Glyph of Elementals. Arcane Power is not removed when entering combat and drastically increases the burst damage of the build if you can use it again earlier in the beginning of a fight. After that, we'll just cast all weapon skills in Fire Attunement and utilities on cooldown, including the heal skill. Using the arcane skills Arcane Brilliance, Arcane Power and the Flame Barrage from the Elite Elemental allows you to maintain the buff from Elemental Surge quite easily. Since your heal skill does the same DPS as one auto attack, it's not a DPS loss to use it. If you know that there will be large hits coming in, you can also save the Elite skill to trigger this on demand. In this rotation, make sure to try and not interrupt your auto attacks since they have a relatively long cast time. You should pretty much always prioritize Overload Fire as it gives you a 15% damage modifier after using it and ramps up a lot of burning stacks during its cast time due to the well finishes. The closer to the hitbox of the enemy you stand, the more of these finishes will hit. When you notice another important skill becoming available at the same time, you can squeeze that in before though. The first casts of Focus 5, Arcane Power and the Elite Elemental skill can be used at any time since they are instant cast. If you need CC, you can swap to Air and use skill 5 and then swap to Water and use skill 5. You can also use Air 2 here since it's instant cast as well. Usually Fire Attunement won't be ready after you do this, so you have to spend some time in Earth before being able to swap back to Fire. If you need more CC, you can also cast the Air Elite Elemental instead of the Fire one and use its second cast for CC. That's basically it. This win-to-win condition Tempest has a very simple rotation that allows you to focus on mechanics and your surroundings while playing it. It does great damage while doing so and provides boons too. That said, feel free to like and subscribe for the YouTube algorithm. I hope this video was insightful for you and made you want to try Condition Tempest. See you next time and happy spin to winning.